Mozilla's speaker series. I'm Sam. I'm the Director of Insights at the Mozilla Foundation, and it's our pleasure to host Tim tonight. Thank you all for coming. Before I get started, I just want to let you know what the flow of today is going to be. We're going to invite Tim up to have a chat with us to share some of his ideas, and then we'll have a Q&A. So for those of you here in Toronto, you can ask your questions live. We'll have a couple mics. And if you're not here in person, you can either go up, if you're in one of our offices, to a mic in your office, or you can send us your questions via IRC on the Air Mozilla channel or via Slack on the Speaker Series channel. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mark Sermon, our Executive Director of the Mozilla Foundation, up to give a quick introduction and welcome Tim. So everyone, here's Mark.
Hello, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of new ones. I'm always having to get more people come into the Mozilla office here in Toronto. Just as a quick poll, how many people are not from Mozilla here? That is a good showing. Thank you for being here. Well, we invite you to be here more often and to get engaged. And actually, just so you see how many of us there are, how many people are from Mozilla here. There you go. That's about a quarter of who works in this office. So just before I introduce Tim, a little bit of why does Mozilla host events like this, and why do we care about topics like this these days? And the thing that kind of came to me today as a hook for this is Peter Sunday, I think probably yesterday, who's one of the founders of the Pirate Bay, in a talk, and it kind of got tweeted out, said, we basically lost the battle for the internet. And now we're just in risk mitigation mode. And it's not just the party line, I believe it. We can't actually, I think, declare that loss and sit around. The internet is just far too important. I think what we know is that it is more complex and there's more both good and bad in it than we ever thought would be possible in terms of both the complexity and the good and the bad. And at times like this, where Mozilla, both through its software and by building a movement for a healthy internet, believes we do want to keep the internet in our hands, I think we need to really dig in and get new intellectual tools. The thinking we had is, when we first saw HTML, when we first built Firefox about openness, really is only a part of the story. And that's actually a little bit of, where I first started being, a follower of Tim's. Not only did he helped coin and popularize the term net neutrality, which turns out to be a topic of the day. He wrote a book, the first in his, I've now been informed, trilogy. The third one you'll have to wait a few years for. He wrote a book called The Master Switch. And The Master Switch came at a really important time for me. I think I was just starting at Mozilla, or I was about a year or so in. I don't even know if you remember, Tim. I remember sitting at my house, working from home one day and chatting with you about the Master Switch a little bit. And it was a book that both made me feel despondent and then hopeful. Because here we were, this great protector of open source, and Tim had written a book that said, basically there's a pendulum that swings between new technologies being open and over time them getting controlled and taken over by powerful interests. And I think we've certainly seen that with the open internet. And that was the despondent part. It's like, there's nothing we can do. And of course, there is, and I think that, it's not so simple as the pendulum. There's a lot we can do to both stand and guardian that openness, but also look at what other human benefit we want from the internet. And so, I've kind of watched Tim and taken those ideas to heart and talked about them a lot. And I was really happy when this came out, because I think the attention economy, advertising, tracking, the growth of monopolies over what is the media environment of the 21st century is one of those complexities. I don't think Tim Berners-Lee would have seen, or probably most of us would have thought, that we would be in the spot we are now when we first used our first search engine, or when Google first came out, or when we used our first social network. But we are, as Tim will, I'm sure, describe, in a sticky spot with the complexities of the economy we built around this great thing called the internet. And that is the kind of thinking I think we all need to engage with as we stand as guardians of the internet. So I'm going to let Tim talk. For those of you who don't know him, he's written these 2 books I just mentioned. He's a professor at Columbia University in law, and still teaches there. Has done a lot of really important work in government in the last few years, and I think you'll learn a lot, and we'll engage after. And because you will only get a little bit today, I do encourage you to buy not only this book, but also the Master Switch, both at home on my shelf. Excellent to own, just so you can show your own intellectual engagement and prowess, and also very fun to read. So Tim, come on up.
Thanks so much. Great. Thank you, Jenny. Well, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to try an experiment. I've actually never done this, tried this experiment before, but why not go for it? And I don't usually use props, but big today an exception. So I want you to just keep your eyes on that ball and see if you can completely and only pay attention to the ball and nothing else, and see how that goes. And the only point of that experiment is I think as we get more sophisticated, we will be able to estimate how much money we just used up, how much revenue we just used up with you putting all your time and attention into that little bouncing ball. I use the example to introduce the talk, to tell you this is going to be a talk about what really is, if not the currency of our present, is certainly, almost certainly the currency of the future. And that is time and attention. That is one of the last scarce resources. And that is, coincidentally, the anchor of much of the web economy. This 168 hours per week that we have, that we choose to direct through the allocation of attention to different things, and which has proven, in a way which really would seem quite surprising, I think, to other generations, to be something of considerable economic value. So my talk is going to be today in 3 parts. Put my prop away. First, I'm going to talk about the invention of this business model, the attention merchant business model, attention resale. So that's state 1. I'm going to talk about a very relevant second development, which is the invention of advertising. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how this model came to become the dominant model by which the web makes its money. So I'm mixing it up. In some ways, I'm introducing the main themes of the book. The book has a lot more turning points and is more complex. But I'm giving you 2 of the, or 3 of the main turning points that are in the book. And also use this as an excuse to discuss what was alluded to in the introduction, the current state of the web. And I might as well be frank and put my views out forthrightly. I think if the web has not hit rock bottom, it's awfully close. I think that it's in a dark stage of its existence. I think that in most ways, most of the applications have gotten worse instead of better over the last 5 years. But I also think we can do a lot better. So I'm also having this talk, and we're here at Mozilla, which I take as one of the bright lights in this universe. I think Mozilla and a few others who chose different business models are looking good right now. I'm also taking this as a moment to try to inspire what I believe is already happening, a movement to understand how we can do better with the web, what we can do with this very precious technology. And if you want to talk about net neutrality, that's okay with me too. I guess I should, I know there's other people watching other places. I am from Toronto, so I was like coming back. It's, I was flying by Ontario Place on the way into the airport, and I feel like so nostalgic for that. It's like a theme park run by a government. It seems kind of like something only kind of strangely Canadian idea, but it's so charming. And I happen to think Billy Bishop is maybe the best airport in the world. There's a theory, I don't 100% subscribe to it, but occasionally I think it's right, which holds that when something's wrong, something has gotten too large. That's like a basic theory of the universe, not related to my book, not this book at least. And sometimes I think that's true when I'm at Billy Bishop. It's such a small little airport. And you think about other airports, no matter how nicely they're designed, whatever they put into it, if they are big enough, there's just a certain level of human misery that's inescapable. So anyway, great to be back in Toronto. Let me talk about the birth of the advertising economy, the attention economy, the birth of the attention merchant. So one of the things I did in this book is I went looking for the source of the Nile. Where did this all start? This idea that you are a product, not a consumer, that you're being bundled and resold is not an intuitive way of doing business. In fact, even as I said it to you, maybe some of you are like, what the hell is he talking about? So let me talk about where it started, where I found it. Back in the early 1830s, there was a man named Benjamin Day living in New York City. He's not well known, but I think he's an inventor, maybe with the same importance in terms of his effect on our daily lives as almost any of the great inventors, Edison or the Wright brothers. He was a printer, and he had an idea for a newspaper. Now, newspapers in the 1830s were a little different than today's in the following fashion. First of all, they were expensive luxury items aimed at a very narrow clientele, mainly the business and political elite, a little bit like the Wall Street Journal is today. They don't try to reach a large audience. Second of all, they were excruciatingly boring. They were. If you read the old newspapers, they just are not much to look into. They reprint speeches in full and so forth. So Benjamin Day had this idea, frankly, a new business model. His idea was to reduce the price of his newspaper all the way down to a single penny. So he's now selling something where, if he had no other source of revenue, he would lose money and go out of business. So it's sort of suicide mission. And his idea was to try to make the newspaper as interesting as possible, as full of lively, crazy, interesting sort of news, so he would reach a mass audience. He was one of the first to have this idea of a mass media, put it that way. And his business proposition was that if he attracted enough consumers, he could then resell their attention. He could convince advertisers that he had something worth selling, therefore the idea that he was selling his audience as a product. So he tried this out, ran his newspaper, sold 300 copies the first day, lost money. Didn't work. So he went a little bit further, kept going on. He had the ingenious idea of beginning to report crime stories. And if you're interested in the history of journalism, you can see that there was a new interest in what are now called human interest, or stories that would appeal to ordinary people. In fact, I look back at the old one. Here's a headline from the early New York Sun, and he'll show you how interesting this is. A melancholy suicide. It's more interesting than a reprint of a political speech. It was a story, sad story actually, about this man who was in love with a woman. Father didn't approve, was going to ship him off to Indonesia to break the proposed marriage, and instead in his home he took a huge number of some kind of pill and killed himself. So that was the story. Sad, but kind of captivating, interesting. So clickbaity a little bit. So you read these early 1830 stories, you realize they're full of these things that get you interested. And I want to suggest, so there was this moment that came. He got to 1,000 audience, got larger. This magical moment where the lift of his advertising revenue began to exceed the drag of the costs, and the business model took off. And I want to suggest that nothing has ever really been the same since, because that business model has propelled essentially our daily lives, where, in your average day, much, I don't know if all, but much of what you consume is free, although I say quotes free in the sense that you pay for it with your time and attention. It's the business model behind Google, behind Facebook, to some degree behind Mozilla. It's a little complicated. But behind much of the web, and we'll explain how that came to be. It's also the business model behind between broadcast television, much of radio, and so on. So this was this important moment. The early days, however, teach us some other lessons, because it wasn't long before this successful business model attracted competitors. There was a newspaper, the New York Herald, which went after the New York Sun, copying the business model exactly, but putting more of an emphasis on death, killings, murder. Their most famous story, the one that dragged so much in, was in-person reporting of the murder of a prostitute who had been lit on fire and chopped into pieces, or at least killed with an axe. And so the editor went in person, described what he'd seen, which was a new thing, this idea of reporting. And that stuff, I mean, it's some of the techniques for gaining attention have not changed. He described the corpse as more beautiful than Aphrodite, you know, strangely alluring with its white skin, yet marred only by burn marks and gashes on the head. Very intense stuff. So he specialized, the New York Herald specialized in death. Its second main tactic was the editor was constantly picking fights with other newspaper editors, creating these massive trolling wars where they went back and forth and called each other, you know, despicable names and so on. So this technique, now, you know, known to professional wrestlers, politicians, and rappers, of gaining attention of the giant fight, is seen right away from the early days. And then facing this competition, the New York Sun, our friend Benjamin Day, introduced a new element into the equation, which I think you'll find familiar. One day, you know, they're starting to suffer in competition. Out came a series of dispatches, a six-part series, an exclusive, from South Africa, from one of the leading scientists of the day, who had the world's largest telescope and was reporting on his findings, very scientific language, of what had been seen on the moon. So, you know, it wasn't too controversial at first. There were giant lakes, not unlike the Great Lakes, trees as tall as yew trees. Things started to get a little more intense when they discovered unicorns on the surface. In the final part of the series, the man-bat was discovered living on the moon, creating, by the way, a sensation. Kind of like humans, a little bit shorter, some hair, more sexually active than normal. They said that their norms were not which we would find appropriate, but otherwise like humans. So you can imagine, you know, the discovery of life on the moon, pretty good news. This drove the circulation of the New York Sun to levels unseen, in fact, the highest in the entire world. And so you have a situation where within essentially 5 years of the invention of the attention economy, you have discovery of some version of clickbait, some version of trolling, and finally fake news. All of it immediately arrived on as essential to the information economy. And I think it teaches you something about this business model that is unusual. When you are, as the colloquium says, interested in eyeballs as opposed to dollars, competition's a little different. The race does not necessarily go to the most verifiable, the most trusted, but often the most alluring, sensational, unusual, attention-getting. You know, it's why BuzzFeed ended up, in some sense, winning the internet media wars. You know, it's why, in some ways, Facebook, which relies on that ancient device of narcissism, has been so successful as an attention product. There's something different about this economy, and the point of this book is to try to understand how competition in this world works, how it developed historically, and what are the features of the attention economy. I should add, this is a smart audience, I also have a paper, if you look for it, that is a more economic analysis of this thing, if you want to sort of try to get into this, into imagining attention markets in economic language. So that's one sort of turning point in this history. Let me tell you another, and there are many, but these are just, highlights, a few stories from the book. The attention economy, I think, really gained its relevance as a big revenue source. But, with the invention of attention merchants, you had something that powered the tabloid and other kinds of press. the really big impact came with the invention of advertising. Now you may think, well, there's always been advertising at some point, but I want to talk about a certain kind of advertising. There's always been informational advertising. There's always been, signs that say you can buy corn here or rice or shoes or something. But that's different than what an advertising person would call real advertising. Real advertising makes you do something you might not otherwise do. It does more than provide information. It creates demand, as an economist would put it. And it's very interesting to wonder, well, where did this come from? Going back from the history, there's a lot, and I want to just describe two particular areas where it came from. One sort of under-recognized thinking in advertising is the field of patent medicine. So, 115 years ago, medicine was a much more, even shakier than it is today in terms of its results and what it could do for you. And so most medicines, it was an unregulated area, were sold. Whether they worked or not was not clear. And because of that fact, the industry that one of the businesses I looked at quite carefully was the snake oil industry. There was a snake oil industry. There was a fellow named Clark Stanley who apparently pioneered the product. He was a very attention-getting gentleman. They understood attention economy as well. They always needed people to be interested in their products. Now, because snake oil did not actually work, in fact, an experimental study of it revealed that it didn't actually contain snake oil later on. I think it had some kind of oil, but not snake oil. It all had to be in the advertising. The product that doesn't work needs a really good ad. So this is why they developed the technique. And some of the most classic techniques are found. If you start, if you read the book and you see them, you'll start to see them everywhere. I'm going to boil them down to a sort of three-part little thing you can see. So like attention merchants themselves, advertisers understood they had to get attention. So there had to be something about it. Even the word snake oil sounds evocative. If you see the ads, we'll see the ads in a minute. They have this strange twisting snakes. That, oh, did I mention there's a slideshow? I'll do a slideshow afterwards. It goes with my bouncing ping pong as ways to keep the audience entertained. Strange twisting problems. So they always had something weird and evocative about it. They kind of gained the attention of even a casual audience. The second, and I think this is very important about advertising, was this technique or trick of learning to understand or speak to very deeply held fears or desires. Now, medicine had a natural way of doing so. It was almost always promising to cure a chronic problem or deliver something you wanted, like longer life. So you could see how medicine is a natural place to learn about medicine. Who here, think about yourself. You probably have at least one kind of health problem, or maybe you don't like fear death. The idea of deliverance from that was so alluring. I did some research on this, and Facebook, I think, thinks I want to live forever because now they're always showing me these pills for like this stuff hasn't really necessarily changed. There's, 1,000,001 pills that will apparently make you live forever. So there's that identification. And then finally, this powerful technique of offering yourself confidently as a solution. This is the hard sell. I have what it takes to solve your problem. The snake oil has been tested. Thousands of people tried it. It works. Here it is. And the more you look at it, you'll see that much of our current advertising still follows that basic model. So that was where it was invented. I'll say that it got a big push forward when advertising, which at one point was a very disreputable field, people didn't have much to do with it because it was patent medicine, tabloids, so forth. It took a big jump forward when the British government started using advertising to recruit an army in World War I in its propaganda materials. That made a huge step forward. And finally, by the 1920s, had become a mainstream idea. And you will see, and I think we'll see in some of the slides, that it again goes back to that basic goal of trying to increase demand for products. They use some of the similar techniques to one thing you'll see is they borrow almost directly from patent medicine. Consider Listerine. I don't know if you've thought a lot about Listerine, but it was once originally sold as an antiseptic, a medical thing, marketed for cleaning floors at some point. Someone at one point said, we got to figure out a way to move this product a little better. It was kind of a little bit of a patent medicine. Someone said, here's our trick. At the time, the 1920s, selling to women had become popular. So sat around and said, well, what do women fear? Well, of course, women are afraid of not getting married. So they created this character, poor Edna, often a bridesmaid, never a bride, who, although she was as charming and as beautiful as any of her friends, was rapidly approaching the tragic age of 30 without having found a husband like her friends. Why? Bad breath. Halitosis, your friends will not tell you. That's the problem. Solution, Listerine. Even right now, you might start to wonder, maybe you're not. Maybe you're I certainly do whenever I tell that story. So you can see the same techniques. And I think the relevant part to back this up to the attention merchants and the attention economy is once you have this idea of advertising as something that can turn attention into demand for products. So in a convincing way, if you can prove, in other words, that I have, a million eyeballs and that will turn into plus 5% sales or plus 20% for this product, then you have taken the straw of human attention and turned it directly into gold. That is the real importance. That's the link between the attention merchants, advertising, the attention economy, and the invention of advertising. So I want to skip ahead now to about the year 2000. Skipping the introduction of radio, some really good stuff that's hard to skip, but I don't want to spend forever. And turn to the web and turn to our present times. In fact, I want to turn to an individual company by the name of Google. Around the year 2000, assume you've heard of Google, unlike New York Sun. In the year 2000, Google was, in many ways, like many other startups, in the sense that it had a product that had proven itself incredibly popular. The search engine, I can remember by then, people were starting to say, this thing's got something going for it. It's, that Alta Vista thing doesn't, does anyone remember Alta Vista? Competitor. Do you remember they didn't even have their website? It was like something that they didn't have the altavista.com website. That was like someone travel agency or something. Anyway, maybe there was a mistake in retrospect. And there was a couple other Bigfoot, I think. There was a couple other, but people were saying this Google thing has got something. And so people were going to Google like crazy and they were starting to like it. I said it was like a typical startup in the sense that it started to get some success, but had no business model to speak of. And so question is, all right, well, what, bleeding money, what do we do? So you might think that in retrospect it would be obvious that Google would go to an advertising business model. It has something incredibly valuable because it has not just a large amount of human attention, but has attention of a particular kind. Many of you may know this, but when you use Google, are telling Google what you're looking for. And also your mental, when we mean attention, we are actually talking about access to the mind. To get someone's attention is to have them process your message in priority to other messages they may be receiving. And the state of the mind that Google was identifying was one where people were making decisions and looking for stuff, trying to learn about things. And that's a very rarefied state. It's certainly different than the one I have when I'm teaching class. People in that very specific, way of thinking. So it had this so it might have seemed obvious, but Larry Page, in his very famous '96 paper, Larry Page and Sergey Brin had written an appendix to their paper, which was all about the evils of advertising as related to search engines. And they made the point, and this is paraphrasing, not an exact quote, but something like, the search engine can only serve one master. Either you serve the people or you serve advertisers. You know, advertising is inherently corruptive to a search engine because it will cause you to direct traffic towards the interests of your advertisers away. So they had this, you know, internal dispute. And so they came up with the answer, which many of you may know is Adwords. And in it, I think it's both an invention of extreme genius. There's no question about that. And also, however, betrays almost classic, almost the original sin of the Silicon Valley geek, which is to think that you can invent yourself around every ethical problem. So the great thing about AdWords, does everyone here know what AdWords is? It's Google's advertising, which keys up originally very small ads related to what you're searching for and puts them in a space separate to the main search. So that's AdWords. And the genius is, you know, several. First of all, it's very lucrative. They bid off the spots to people, whoever would bid the most. They had, in the early days, the idea they would show you the minimum amount of advertising necessary and only show the ad if people actually clicked on it with any regularity, suggesting people are interested in it. And of course, you know, it worked, and not every kind of product works. But what Google thought, I think, and this comes to the discussion about the web, was that here with this product, we have invented something which solves the problem of money forever and has no effect on our product itself. So they had said themselves, the trouble with advertising-based models is at some point they're going to force you to corrupt your product and bend it towards, you know, this revenue source. But they thought with AdWords, we have insulated ourselves permanently from this problem. And we no longer, at some level, have to worry about this inherently challenging corruption caused by advertising. Actually, AdWords itself was invented by a Canadian, I forgot his name, he's in the book, who hated advertising. And you'll see, interestingly, in the history of Silicon Valley, many of the most successful companies had principals or people who hated advertising. And I think they hated it for a reason. I mean, engineers often hate advertising because it's kind of like a bug. You have to make your product worse, usually, in order to serve some other thing. I mean, when you think about it, and this gets a little more into the economics of it, or the logic of it, any advertising-driven product is always in the position of serving two masters. In the sense, we've said that the point is reselling an audience. So it can never be 100% user-directed. It always has to do something for the user, or else the user doesn't show up at all. But then also create that pivotal moment where you resell off, you make that pivot and resell access to their minds to advertisers. Well, the brilliant thing about AdWords, at least for the first, let's say, 10 years, is it barely showed any ads. It seemed to have no effect on the product. Google could kind of confidently, I forget their motto. You know, I gave this talk in Seattle, Google, and they had right on the wall, you know, do it. I think it's like, take care of the user experience, everything else will follow. I think that was true and, you know, brilliant about the model for, say, let's say the first eight years or so. But eventually this business model will take its toll. And one thing I think that happened to almost all of Silicon Valley, I'm going to accept two companies or two institutions, maybe more. I'll give credit to Mozilla for its business model, not only because I'm here. I know it's very dependent on Google, but that's but the general idea of taking a nonprofit was important in this area, and also Wikipedia, who took some steps to say, you know, I don't know, I'm not sure the money is going to continue to be free. Where I'm blaming or faulting Google, and to some degree Facebook, although Facebook was never as self-conscious about these issues, was mistaking advertising driven and free, or thinking that an advertising model would solve all of these problems forever. I also blame some people in the open source movement, frankly, or not necessarily open source, but in the more general openness movement, who thought it would be more or less fine to adopt a standard corporate model, promise revenue that would double every year, every quarter, forever, and expect that that would have no impact whatsoever on how the businesses operated. Twitter is a grand example of that particular problem. So what I will suggest is that over the last several years, I think I said this earlier, the chickens have come home to roost on this business model because it does make its demands. It is, at some level, a corrupting business model. And I think it has forced much of the web, I'm going to talk the big guys and the little guys in different ways, to transform how they do things. So when it comes to the bigger companies, Google and Facebook, they have, whatever their motives, particularly Google, which had its ideas at the beginning to only serve the user, they have had to devote more and more of their expertise, engineering talent, general efforts to find ways to convince people to spend more time on the site, to click on things they wouldn't necessarily click on. A generation, or at least years of engineering efforts, has gone into the pursuit of the almighty click. And if people thought the search for ratings was corrupting in television, I will say to you the search for the click has made ratings look mild in comparison. It's gotten, people are starting to come out. There's Tristan Harris. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He's a former Google engineer who started this movement. And he and other people sort of quit saying, we're using all these kind of lowly tricks to get people to click on stuff that are unworthy. Doing things like, almost like magician's tricks, to sort of hypnotize people into clicking on things they wouldn't otherwise want to, eliminating stopping cues. Facebook, similarly, started very little advertising, but has been forced to get further and further into a model where it takes something that's very pure, very beautiful, namely connecting with your friends and family, has kind of always done everything it can to keep you on the site as long as possible, even when it's not really what you would want. And those are the big sites. I think the rest of the web, particularly in the media era, have been, deeply absorbed with the need, and I don't blame anyone involved. I think it's just what the business model has demanded, to shape their content, shape their existence in search of clicks. BuzzFeed is sort of the classic example of it, but everyone's been pushed that direction, including most of the news media. And it's created the product, which I think is a lot worse than we are capable of collectively. I don't know if you've had this experience. This is kind of what started motivated me writing this book. Have you ever sat down intending to do one thing? You want to write like one email, and suddenly like 2 or 3 hours go by? I think the web has started to serve no little less than patent medicine in some ways as a serious, well, forget about that, as a serious impediment to getting things done. That's a strange result for something that was designed as a way of enhancing humanity, which was, built to try to make us better, bring us closer together, has somehow served as something when you go near it, it's kind of like a force field that leads you to things you didn't necessarily want to do. In fact, it's become a challenge to the very idea of autonomy, free will, to quote Rush, Toronto band, and this idea that we direct our own lives has become somewhat threatened by the web, and that is not, I think, what we should want to do with this product. So that is some of what I think has happened. Well, what can be done? or what do I, suggest near the end? I think there is a backlash ongoing. It's evidenced in little things like ad blockers. It's evidenced in larger things like people, frankly, the popularity of advertising free television. It's not so much my point here is to say, advertising is evil and it makes you into it probably does that, but it makes you into some kind of robot or something. It probably does a little of that, but I also think it has this valuable informational role. More, I want to make us aware of the impact of the attention merchant model, of the impact of that model where all of our time and attention is constantly being targeted on the way we live, and ask, particularly for people who are technologists, as to whether we can do better. Whether we can make products that seem to make you feel good after you've done using them, as opposed to feeling like, why did I just waste an hour on that? That help you accomplish goals as opposed to slowing you down. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book in particular, I'm a writer. Many of you may have jobs that require focus or concentration. It seems to me that our tools should help us, but they only half help us. They also are trying to pull us away and move in other directions constantly. Many of you may know that like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak wrote Breakout in one night, or that like Franz Kafka wrote his first the Das Urteil, I forget the English for some reason. Maybe it's called The Process, in one sitting, or Kerouac wrote his novels just like one big piece of paper. I think today it's sometimes harder to do that because you're writing for a while, and then you can imagine like that Kafka would be like writing for a while, then like, oh, what's going on Twitter for a while, and what's going on here. In some ways it's getting harder for us. We're being disabled as humans. So I think it is time for a reclamation movement. I think it's time for a hard look at some of the business models, as alluring as they may be. Free is an incredibly powerful, alluring thing. And I'm not suggesting everything has to become paid, but I am suggesting we have to start taking the costs of this very almost invisible business model a little more seriously. And through that, start to think how we can make the web better. And I believe that Mozilla is one of the entities which is leading this, and I'm proud to be here for that reason. But I think it's a collective movement, and I hope we can do better. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I'm sure everyone has questions or things that they'd like to chat about. So we're going to open it up for a Q&A. I have a few questions that came in through IRC and Slack. But I think first I'll just open it up to folks who are either here in Toronto or listening in one of the other offices, if there's anyone who wants to ask a question. In Toronto, we've got a mic over there. You can also just raise your hand and I can throw you our mic box. So any questions either here in another office? Oh. I can't throw with my left hand, so I'll walk it to you. Yeah.
We are in the attention economy, but the purpose of our application is actually to be educational. What advice, based on kind of this research you've done, when you're in the attention economy and trying to do something that's positive, you're still competing with Facebook, Instagram, all these things that are just distracting you and not doing anything for your life. And while some users will express that, I'd rather be on your app because it's doing something for my life as opposed to wasting time, they still will spend much more time on something like Instagram or Twitter or Facebook. So with that insight, what's a competitive advantage if you're essentially something healthy as opposed to fast food in the attention economy? But how do you
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question, and I in some ways I face it in different ways from a lot of actors. Let me say more than one thing about that question. So more generally, where does a movement come from that think about how they spend their attention and spend it wisely or less wisely. I mean, I hope that this book is part of it. I think there's other actors. I think there's more of a general social movement towards seeing attention as a scarce resource and one that's valuable, one that, frankly, really you need to think of like a currency that lets you do what you want to do. I mean, nothing you can do in your life happens without attention, right? If you want to learn how to play an instrument, you can't like do it on the side while you're on Twitter. You can't. You have to devote attention. I'm always trying new hobbies, and they're all attentional projects. They take whatever amount of time and attention. So that movement, by the way, should, in theory, help those who are able to offer better attentional experiences. The only problem is you are competing, and that's one theme of this book, in a world or an economy that's become much, much more competitive, and where every single sliver is competed for. I think this is something people, don't realize unless they work in this area. Is you think maybe you'll put out something and people will pay attention to it, but you're dealing with, a world where you are facing very talented engineers at Instagram, Facebook, Google, and other places who are using the best techniques they can imagine, and some of the smartest engineers basically get people addicted to the product, right? I sometimes think there's a different book about this, but I sometimes think that we're fooling around with tech addiction the way Victorians, played around with opium and cocaine, just very casual. Oh, this stuff will be fine. Because most of us are nursing at least one little tech addiction somewhere. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one. Like something you're like, geez, what happened? That a little more than I wanted, and my life's a little get interfered with. So, all I can say is that, you have to have a pretty good experience, and people have to be convinced that they want to spend time with your app. More generally, I think the attention business model is a rough one if you're not. If I were starting a new company today, would not be the business model I'd want to be involved in. You probably know, people in this room who are in this market probably know, but so much of it is controlled by two companies that it's really tough.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
All right.
So maybe, thanks, Tim, for a great talk. Maybe I'll give you a double-barreled follow-up to that.
Sure.
Which is, you just said a couple of companies control the attention economy. Mm-hmm. And so when those sorts of things happen, two historical responses have been to, create public media, whether that's the CBC or PBS, or to use antitrust, which I know is another topic you have an interest in. So if what you wanted was a healthier media ecology, do you think public media on a large scale, at the scale of Facebook or the CBC or the BBC or antitrust, are things that movement should be thinking about?
Yeah, let me reserve on the antitrust question. I do. So in terms of public media, now we're in Canada, so it's a slightly different conversation. But I think the public media can play a role and does. Frankly, it's most important at companies like here, or frankly, Wikipedia. It's most important that, actually, it's urgent for the future of humanity, and I'm not really joking, that our main tools become interested in the fate of humanity. We are evolving right now technologically. And unlike biological evolution, it doesn't happen by survival of the fittest. We're choosing it collectively in this strange way, and we're basically choosing it by the tools we're using. And I think there's reason to be concerned about the directions we're evolving, particularly, whether we're getting less or more capable. So in terms of the public media, I don't think like the CBC is the problem and the BBC is the problem. I think they're doing a fairly responsible job. The problem is there's not a CBC equivalent in our major tech tools, with the exception maybe of Wikipedia and maybe of Mozilla, and maybe a smattering of other companies that are sort of thinking about this, although many of them are kind of twisted. So, it's always challenging for government to do things well, but it's less challenging for nonprofits. Someone needs to seize the mantle of trying to create a next generation of human tools that are designed to serve human interests. That's what I think. Yeah.
Tim, there's a question related to the government's role that came in via either IRC or Slack. So it seems like a good follow-on. So the question is, what role can regulations play to offset the extremes that ad-led businesses can take to get to consumers' attentions? Or are there other non-regulatory remedies that you see?
I think we're at the very beginning of that conversation. So I've worked in government a lot. I worked in the White House. I worked in antitrust at American Antitrust Agency. And government is, I'm not, even though I worked in government, maybe because I worked in government, I'm not one who would say, oh, you just, wave the magic wand and government will fix the problem. This is a very subtle challenges we're talking about. We're talking about how you spend your time and attention. And the idea of, let's say, the Trump administration overseeing that is frankly a little bit totalitarian. Right? So, and government has been one of the scariest figures in terms of trying to control there's a pretty entertaining chapter in Nazi Germany on this, entertaining and terrifying chapter on the Third Reich's interest in control of attention. So there's this sort of some real dangers in government getting it right. But I do think we're at the beginning of trying to understand what some of the most coercive or unfair attentional techniques, and maybe even addictive techniques are. So we know from 100 years ago that false advertising, that is just lying about your product, isn't something that we should encourage, should be illegal. And is illegal. But maybe we'll find that some of the techniques that some of the tech companies use are just so insidiously addictive. If someone can prove it, now I haven't proved it, but if there's certain tricks or certain things that are insidiously addictive, I think we should say something about that. And I think what I call attention theft, which is the taking of your attention without any compensation. This is when you are like sitting in an airplane and suddenly start blowing ads at you. Wait a second, where's my free drink or something? I got it. This deal does not, there's no deal. They break the deal. I think that's something when you look at, but I think we're just at the beginning of understanding what are real. I realize I forgot my slides. Do you want to see the slides? All right. Where's the, I got too fired up. Is this the thing that'll advance them? Oh, okay. What about, does this work though? That's right. But okay, so that's what the sun used to look like. Now that doesn't look like, I kind of put it up there to make you realize how, that was the most vivid, exciting thing 100 whatever years ago. People couldn't keep their eyes off of it. But that's the invention that changed everything. Oh, I didn't really talk about posters. These are early advertising posters. And in here was where you can see the beginnings of trying to understand some of the effective bright colors and moving shapes and monsters and attractive women and things like that in an attentional economy. And there's some of that in the book. There's good old Clark Stanley's snake oil with everything his promises and something very alluring. I'll tell you, all of the original patent medicines always had some kind of magic ingredient, like swamp root or carbolic smoke oil or something. I was like, oh, that was then. And then I was looking, I think I was in the shower looking at my shampoo, which had kangaroo carrot juice or something like that. And well, I don't know, you know what I mean? When you start looking for it, you'll notice that mysterious products or mysterious ingredients are still a pretty useful technique. This is a British adoption of advertising techniques. There's the American version. You can see closely this sort of successful utilization of the basic techniques of advertising attention capture, monsters, and so on. I almost made that the cover of the book because I sort of found it interesting. There's poor Edna, who we heard about earlier, who's had a tragic life. Let me see if I can actually read it. Oh, it's hard to read. Well, this is some of the cigarette advertising. I didn't talk about some of this, but there was this effort to make people they're sort of more obvious about things those days. But just the idea of that things will either cause you to lose weight or play on your fears is certainly not receded. That's Amos and Andy. That has to do with primetime TV. Anyway, I didn't talk about the rest of the stuff since it was sort of a shorter talk, but I could talk about it another time. All right, any more questions?
There are lots more questions. We have more questions than we have time,
Right.
but I think we'll have time for one or two. So the next question is, again, remote. What do technologists at Mozilla and elsewhere need to think about as they try to build the platforms of the future? How do we, for example, avoid an augmented reality advertising dystopia?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think Mozilla has the advantage of being a nonprofit and therefore is equipped to be in this position of thinking very hard about what the effect of its tool is on its users and trying to build one that makes people's lives better, to actually follows the slogan that you follow the user's experience, everything will follow. This is a huge advantage. On the other, so that's an advantage. I think Mozilla has done a good job of being sensitive to issues like privacy, which are very closely related to what I haven't had a chance to throw privacy in. So I think attentive to that as well. I guess there is this a really interesting step for Mozilla would be whether it tries to do or experiment. I don't know if you want to make them optional or not, but tries to experiment with taking steps to have your browser make the web a better experience for you. So by, for example, reintroducing stopping queues. So most activities have natural stopping queues, points where you stop wanting to use it, right? And just and most of the successful web companies do everything they can to break them, right? So like a casino, so you get that 3-hour effect. So the interesting question is whether at the browser level, you could do something like, oh, what about introducing stopping queues? I think that would be really an interesting project. I'm sure you think about diversity in your revenue model. It's something everyone in the web, I think, is thinking about. One of the things I think I've learned from writing this book, I don't think getting money from advertising is sort of inherently evil. I think all business models, money is just like that. All business models call for certain compromises, but getting all your money from advertising is risky. I think one reason newspapers have been able to sometimes hold their whatever ethical lines they do, they're not perfect, but they, having subscription and advertising revenue is helpful. I don't know what that says for Mozilla, but I think that lesson for all of tech is quite a valuable one. It's like a slightly diversified revenue portfolio. There's also real risks in pure advertising. I don't think that's a mystery to anyone anymore, but there's not only ethical, but there's also business risk. Did you have a question or no? Oh yeah, okay. Why don't we take someone in the room?
Is there someone in the room who has a question?
Hi. Yeah, I turned it on. My question was actually more around what you just touched on, which was we talk a lot about the attention economy and, taking or trying to buy people's attentions. But what about the privacy side of it, of all the Facebooks and Googles of the world, all of the data they're collecting on us,
right,
and the things that they're able to do by connecting the different data they're collecting on us? Do you think government perhaps has more of a role in that area?
Right. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that question because I think it's a slightly different topic. I will say that I think it's worth thinking for those who are sort of publicly concerned. I think, privacy is very important. I think data collection is important. There is a question as to which is the cart and which is the horse. I mean, one of the reasons that data collection I think is important is it gives better techniques of gaining your attention and using it up. If you, what am I interested in? Old Honda motorcycles or skiing or something, or my friends and family. So putting those things around me makes me pay attention to them more, because ultimately there's this sometimes idea that big data, and sometimes people believe that the big data is intrinsically valuable, but it might be it's only valuable because it allows you to gain attention. So that's a slight pushback against all the emphasis on data and asking whether attention is the real commodity, or at least of equal importance in your thinking. Yes.
We're at time.
Oh, we are,
I know,
okay.
it just flew by. So if you guys are here in Toronto, I invite you to stick around. Tim, I don't know if you can stick around at all, but we can definitely continue to have conversations about these really interesting ideas and issues that Tim has raised.
Let me give you a closing comment.
Yeah.
So, this talk has been something of a downer. I think if you're in tech, I mean, I'll just admit it. But I think there's always when things are low that there's new opportunities. There's a natural, returning to my first book, there's a natural cycle to these sort of things. And there is, pretty tough to be the next Google, maybe at this point, but there is, as Google, as a search engine, but there is always opportunity in these kind of moments where something is going wrong with existing business models. That's where, and there is, again, this chance to re-examine, as tech goes through, I think it's sort of dark period of the soul, re-examine what this enterprise is supposed to be all about. And so I actually, in some ways, think these are great times to be in tech. It's a chance to be part of a turning to what tech was supposed to be about, which is making people's lives better and enhancing the human race. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tim. And yeah, like